The champagne glasses clinked together in perfect harmony, catching the warm glow of string lights draped across my parents' backyard patio. 15 people raised their glasses in unison, voices blending into a chorus of "Cheers to 2025" as confetti cannons exploded overhead. I watched from the kitchen window, my own glass of sparkling cider growing warm in my trembling hand, as my family celebrated the new year without me. Just 30 minutes earlier, I had been setting up the champagne station, arranging the crystal flutes I'd bought specifically for this moment. The same moment I'd been excluded from when my brother Marcus announced that this year's toast would be intimate family only, and suggested I help serve drinks instead of participating. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the house I actually owned, watching people toast in the backyard of a property that legally belonged to me, while being treated like hired help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Chen, and I've spent the last 8 years building a real estate investment portfolio in Phoenix, Arizona. What started as a way to secure my own financial future had somehow morphed into becoming the silent benefactor for my entire family's housing situation. At 32, I owned 4 properties across the Phoenix metropolitan area, including the ranch-style house in Ahwatukee where my parents lived rent-free, and the modern townhouse in Scottsdale where my younger brother Marcus resided with his Instagram-famous girlfriend, Sophia. The irony of my situation had been building for months, but tonight it reached a crescendo that I never saw coming. As I stood there watching my family's New Year's celebration through the kitchen window, I couldn't help but think about how different things had been just 5 years ago, when I was the one being celebrated for my success and generosity. It all started in 2019 when I graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in finance and immediately dove into real estate investing. Phoenix was experiencing unprecedented growth, and I had the foresight to recognize the opportunity. While my friends were blowing their entry-level salaries on weekend trips to Las Vegas and expensive dinners, I was living in a studio apartment, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and putting every spare penny into real estate education and my first property purchase. My parents, Linda and Robert Chen, had always been supportive of my ambitions, though they never quite understood my obsession with real estate markets and investment strategies. My father worked as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant, and my mother managed the household while working part-time at a local daycare. They were hardworking, honest people who had given Marcus and me everything they could, but they weren't financially savvy. When the 2020 pandemic hit and property values began their dramatic climb, they found themselves in a precarious position. Their landlord decided to sell the house they'd been renting for 12 years, giving them 60 days to either buy it themselves or find somewhere else to live. The problem was, their credit scores weren't great, and they didn't have enough saved for a down payment. That's when I stepped in. Using my growing real estate knowledge and pristine credit score, I purchased the house they'd been renting and allowed them to stay there indefinitely. I told them to think of it as their home and just contribute what they could toward the monthly expenses. Marcus was a different story entirely. 3 years younger than me, he'd always been the charming one, the one who could talk his way out of trouble and into opportunities. While I was buried in spreadsheets and property listings, Marcus was building his social media presence and dating a string of increasingly ambitious women. When he met Sophia during his senior year of college, everything changed. Suddenly, Marcus needed a place that would photograph well for Sophia's Instagram content. Their relationship moved quickly, and within 6 months they were talking about moving in together. The problem was that Marcus had chosen a creative writing major and was working part-time at a coffee shop while trying to build his freelance writing career. Sophia made decent money from her social media sponsorships, but it was inconsistent and unreliable. Neither of them could qualify for a mortgage on the type of place they wanted in trendy Scottsdale, where all the other influencers lived. Once again, I found myself in the position of family benefactor, I purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom townhouse in North Scottsdale, complete with the kind of modern finishes and natural lighting that Sophia needed for her content creation. The monthly mortgage payment was substantial, but I figured I was helping my brother get established while also making a solid investment in an appreciating market. Marcus and Sophia moved in with promises to contribute toward expenses and help with maintenance, though those contributions became increasingly sporadic as time went on. For 3 years, this arrangement worked reasonably well. My parents were grateful and respectful of the fact that I owned their home, often checking with me before making any significant changes or improvements. Marcus and Sophia were less consistent with their appreciation, but they generally acknowledged that I was the reason they could afford to live in such a desirable area. I felt good about being able to help my family while building wealth for myself. The shift began slowly, so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. It started with small comments during family gatherings, little jokes about how Emma was the landlord, or how they needed to ask permission from the boss before hanging new artwork. Initially, I laughed along, thinking it was harmless family teasing, but the comments became more frequent and carried an edge of resentment that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Sophia, in particular, seemed to chafe at the reminder that the beautiful home she showcased on social media wasn't actually hers. She began making passive-aggressive comments about wanting to personalize their space and how restrictive it was to live in someone else's property. Marcus, caught between his girlfriend's complaints and his dependence on my generosity, started becoming defensive whenever real estate or housing costs came up in conversation. The dynamic shifted even more dramatically last spring when Marcus landed a contract writing job that paid better than anything he'd done before. Suddenly, he was talking about becoming more independent and how he and Sophia were ready to take the next step in their relationship. I was genuinely happy for his professional success and assumed that his increased income would lead to more consistent contributions toward the townhouse expenses. Instead, the opposite happened. Marcus and Sophia seemed to interpret his modest career advancement as proof that they no longer needed help, conveniently forgetting that his new income still wouldn't qualify them for the mortgage on their current home. They stopped offering to help with maintenance issues and began treating the townhouse as if it were truly theirs, making decisions about renovations and changes without consulting me. The most telling incident happened in September when Sophia decided she wanted to convert the 3rd bedroom into a professional content studio. She hired contractors to install special lighting and acoustic panels without asking permission, then presented me with the bill as if I should be grateful for the improvements to my property. When I expressed concern about the unauthorized modifications, Sophia accused me of being controlling and suggested that maybe they should start looking for their own place. Marcus supported Sophia's position, arguing that they'd been paying rent for years and should have some say in how their home looked. I tried to explain that their sporadic contributions didn't constitute rent payments, and that as the property owner, I needed to approve major modifications. The conversation devolved into an argument that ended with Marcus accusing me of treating him like a child, and Sophia storming out, muttering about toxic family dynamics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My parents, caught in the middle of this tension, tried to mediate but ultimately sided with Marcus and Sophia. My mother suggested that maybe I was being too rigid about the properties and that families should be more flexible with each other. My father pointed out that Marcus was trying to build a life with Sophia and needed space to make his own decisions. Neither of them seemed to fully grasp that I was the one taking on all the financial risk and responsibility for these properties. As the months passed, the family dynamic continued to deteriorate. Holiday gatherings became tense affairs where housing and real estate were carefully avoided topics. Marcus and Sophia began hosting their own events at the townhouse, parties, and gatherings that I learned about through social media posts rather than personal invitations. They were building a social circle in Scottsdale that didn't include me, using the home I provided as their launching pad into a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. The final straw should have come in November, when I discovered that Sophia had been representing the townhouse as her own property in sponsored content deals. She was partnering with home decor and furniture brands, showcasing her home to her 40,000 followers without ever mentioning that she was essentially a guest in someone else's property. When I confronted her about this, she claimed it was just creative licensing, and that disclosing the ownership details would hurt her brand authenticity. Marcus defended Sophia's position, arguing that since they lived there, it was effectively their home, regardless of the legal paperwork. He accused me of being jealous of their social media success and suggested that I was trying to sabotage Sophia's career out of spite. The accusation was so unfair and hurtful that I seriously considered asking them to move out immediately. But I held back, hoping that the situation would improve after the holidays. I told myself that the stress of Sophia's growing business and Marcus's career pressures were making them both unreasonable, and that once things settled down, we could return to a more respectful dynamic. I convinced myself that family was worth the temporary discomfort and financial strain. That's what made tonight's exclusion so particularly devastating. I had spent weeks preparing for this New Year's Eve celebration, coordinating with my mother to plan a menu that would accommodate everyone's dietary preferences and budget considerations. I purchased all the alcohol, including the expensive champagne that was now being raised in toasts I wasn't part of. I hired the cleaning service that prepared the house for guests and bought the decorations that created the festive atmosphere. Everyone was enjoying. More than that, I had been looking forward to this night as an opportunity to reset family relationships for 2025. I planned to announce during the traditional New Year's toast that I was officially gifting both properties to my parents and Marcus, transferring ownership as a gesture of love and commitment to family unity. I had already met with my attorney to begin the paperwork and was prepared to absorb the significant tax implications of the gifts. But 3 hours before the party was scheduled to begin, Marcus pulled me aside and delivered what he described as difficult news. He explained that this year's celebration would be more intimate than usual, focused on core family members, as they shared their most personal goals and achievements from the past year. Sophia had suggested that including me in the toast might make some guests uncomfortable, since I wasn't married or in a serious relationship, and my presence might highlight the different life stages represented in the group. The explanation was so absurd and hurtful that I initially thought Marcus was joking. When I realized he was serious, I asked who exactly would be participating in this intimate family gathering. The guest list, it turned out, included not only my parents, Marcus and Sophia, but also Sophia's 2 sisters who were visiting from California, 3 of Marcus's college friends who had driven up from Tucson, and 2 couples from their Scottsdale social circle. So the intimate family gathering that was too personal for me, the person who owned the house where it was being held, somehow included people I'd never met before tonight. The exclusion was so blatantly targeted and cruel that I struggled to process it emotionally. Marcus insisted that I was overreacting and that I could still attend the party, just not participate in the midnight toast. He suggested I could help serve drinks and take photos for Sophia's social media coverage of the event. I spent the next 3 hours moving through the party preparation in a state of numb shock, helping to set up an event that I was simultaneously hosting and being excluded from. Guests arrived throughout the evening, many of them commenting on the beautiful house and asking about my family's good fortune in living in such a desirable neighborhood. I smiled and made small talk while internally screaming about the irony of the situation. As midnight approached and the toast preparation began, I retreated to the kitchen and watched through the window as my family and their friends gathered in the backyard I'd landscaped and maintained for the past 4 years. Sophia had positioned herself at the center of the group, her phone propped up to capture the perfect angle for her Instagram story. Marcus stood beside her with his arm around her waist, holding a champagne flute filled with Dom Perignon that I'd purchased that afternoon. My parents flanked them on either side, looking proud and happy as they prepared to share their gratitude and hopes for the new year. The scene was picture perfect, exactly the kind of family moment that I'd been hoping to create and participate in. Instead, I was watching from the kitchen like an outsider, holding a glass of sparkling cider because I couldn't bring myself to open the expensive champagne I'd bought for a celebration I wasn't welcome to join. That's when something inside me finally snapped. Not with anger or rage, but with a cold, clear understanding of exactly where I stood in this family dynamic. I wasn't a daughter or sister who happened to own some property. I was a financial resource who had outlived her usefulness now that everyone was comfortable and established. I was the invisible foundation that everyone else's happiness was built on, taken for granted and dismissed when convenient. As I watched Sophia raise her glass and begin speaking about gratitude and new beginnings, knowing that she was simultaneously broadcasting this moment to thousands of followers as if it were happening in her own home, I finally understood that nothing I could give or sacrifice would ever be enough to earn genuine respect and inclusion from these people. They would take everything I offered and still find ways to diminish my worth and exclude me from the joy that my generosity made possible. The realization wasn't devastating anymore. It was liberating. For the first time in years, I saw the situation with perfect clarity, unclouded by guilt or hope or family loyalty. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew I had the power to do it. As the countdown to midnight began outside, I quietly pulled out my phone and began making the calls that would change everything. The first call I made was to my property management company's emergency line. It was 11:47 p.m. on New Year's Eve, but Phoenix Property Solutions offered 24/7 service for urgent situations, and I considered this pretty urgent. The night manager, Derek, answered on the third ring, his voice professional despite the late hour and background noise of what sounded like his own celebration. "Emma, this is unexpected. What's going on?" Derek had been managing my rental properties for 2 years and knew that I wasn't the type to call unless something serious was happening. I took a deep breath and delivered the news that would set everything in motion. I need immediate 30-day notices prepared for both the Ahwatukee property and the Scottsdale townhouse. The tenants are family members, but they're no longer operating under our previous informal arrangement. I want this handled as a standard tenant situation, effective tomorrow morning. Derek paused for a moment, and I could hear him moving to a quieter location. "Emma, are you sure about this? It's New Year's Eve, and once we start formal eviction proceedings, there's no easy way to reverse the process. Family situations can be complicated." I glanced out the kitchen window where the countdown was reaching its final seconds. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. These people need to understand that living in someone else's property comes with expectations of basic respect. They've forgotten that entirely. "Understood. I'll have the notices drafted tonight and hand-delivered first thing tomorrow morning. Do you want them served simultaneously?" "Yes. Both properties at exactly 9 a.m. I want this coordinated." As I spoke, fireworks began exploding outside, and the sound of celebration drifted through the windows. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was dismantling my family's housing security while they celebrated the new year in blissful ignorance. The second call went to my attorney, Margaret Wong, whose firm specialized in real estate law and family asset protection. Margaret was known for working around the clock when necessary, and her answering service connected me immediately. When she heard my voice, she sounded concerned. "Emma, it's almost midnight. Are you all right?" "I'm perfect. Actually, I need you to halt all paperwork related to the property gifts we discussed. The ownership transfer documents for my parents and Marcus should be stopped immediately. In fact, I want you to prepare documentation that formalizes their status as tenants with standard lease agreements." Margaret had been my attorney for 3 years and understood the family dynamics involved in my real estate holdings. This is a significant change from what we discussed last month. Are you certain you want to move forward with treating family members as standard tenants? Margaret, they've been treating me like a landlord rather than family for months. It's time I embrace that role officially. I want market rate rent agreements, security deposits, and all standard tenant obligations spelled out clearly. No more informal arrangements or family favors. I can have everything prepared by Monday morning, but Emma, I have to ask if you've considered the long-term implications for your family relationships. I watched as Marcus and Sophia posed for selfies with champagne glasses, using my home's outdoor lighting setup to create the perfect New Year's Eve content for social media. The long-term implications of continuing to enable their disrespect are worse than any temporary discomfort from establishing boundaries. These people need to learn that generosity isn't the same as obligation. My third call was to Sarah Martinez, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury rentals and had been trying to convince me for months to put my properties on the short-term rental market. Sarah answered immediately, sounding surprised but pleased to hear from me. Emma, happy. New Year! I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Sarah, remember how you've been telling me I could make significantly more money renting my properties to professionals and visiting executives instead of keeping them occupied by family members? Of course. Your Scottsdale townhouse alone could bring in $4,000 a month easily, maybe more during peak season. The Ahwatukee house could get $2,800 minimum. Are you finally ready to maximize your investment potential? I'm ready to explore all options. How quickly could you have both properties evaluated for rental market placement? Sarah's excitement was palpable. I could have preliminary assessments completed by Wednesday and professional photography scheduled for next weekend. Emma, this could transform your cash flow situation entirely. You've been leaving serious money on the table by not capitalizing on Phoenix's rental market demand. As I finished the call with Sarah, the countdown outside reached 0 and the celebration erupted into cheers and music. I felt strangely calm watching the festivities through the kitchen window, knowing that I had just set in motion a series of events that would completely reshape my family's understanding of our relationship. They were celebrating the new year, while I was giving them an entirely new reality to navigate. The fourth call was to my accountant, David Kim, whose firm handled all my real estate tax obligations and financial planning. David was working late, preparing for the tax season rush, and when he answered his office line, he sounded tired but focused. Emma, I'm surprised to hear from you tonight. Are you calling about the gift tax implications we discussed for the property transfers? Actually, I'm calling to cancel those calculations entirely. Instead, I need you to prepare documentation showing the fair market value of housing I've been providing to family members over the past several years. I want to understand exactly how much money I've essentially given away through below-market housing arrangements. David was quiet for a moment before responding. That's a significant shift in approach. Are you considering charging your family members market rate rent going forward? I'm considering a lot of things, David. What I need from you is hard numbers showing the opportunity cost of my generosity. How much rental income have I foregone? What tax advantages have I missed by not treating these as legitimate rental properties? I want a complete financial picture of what my family arrangement has actually cost me. I can have a comprehensive analysis ready by the end of next week. Emma, are you sure you want to pursue this direction? Family financial arrangements can be emotionally complicated to unwind. I looked out at Marcus and Sophia, who were now taking turns recording video messages for social media, using my backyard as their backdrop while talking about their goals for 2025. David, the emotional. Complications started when my family decided to treat me like a bank rather than a person. I'm just choosing to embrace the transactional nature of our relationship that they've already established. My final call was to my friend Jessica Torres, who worked as a property inspector and had been encouraging me for months to be more business-minded about my real estate investments. Jessica answered on the first ring, clearly still awake despite the late hour. Emma, Happy New Year! Are you calling to finally tell me you're taking my advice about treating your properties like actual business assets? Jessica, I need professional property inspections completed on both family properties as soon as possible. I want documentation of any damage, unauthorized modifications, or maintenance issues that need to be addressed. Full reports that could be used for security deposit purposes. Jessica's voice shifted to professional mode immediately. Are you transitioning these properties to standard rental arrangements? I'm transitioning everything about my approach to these properties. My family has made it clear that they see me as a service provider rather than a relative, so I'm going to start operating like one. I need to know exactly what condition my properties are in and what it will cost to restore them to rental-ready standards. I can be there tomorrow afternoon for both properties. Emma, I have to say, I'm proud of you for finally putting business considerations ahead of family pressure. You've been undervaluing your generosity for years. As I hung up from the final call, the party outside was reaching full swing. Someone had turned up the music, and I could see people dancing on the patio while Sophia directed an impromptu photo shoot using the outdoor furniture I'd selected and purchased. Marcus was playing bartender with the premium liquor I'd stocked, making elaborate cocktails for guests who had no idea they were consuming thousands of dollars worth of alcohol purchased by the woman who'd been excluded from their celebration. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion and realized that tonight definitely qualified. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my situation rather than being swept along by family, expectations, and guilt. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol. My phone started buzzing with text messages around 12:30 a.m. as the party began winding down. The first message was from my mother, sent from just outside in the backyard. Emma, honey, we missed you at midnight. Come outside and have some champagne. With us. Sophia saved you a glass. I stared at the message for a long moment, marveling at the casual cruelty of it. They had deliberately excluded me from their intimate family moment, but now that the formal toast was over and the social media content had been captured, they were ready to include me as an afterthought. The champagne Sophia had saved for me was probably the least expensive bottle from the selection I'd purchased earlier that day. I didn't respond to my mother's text. Instead, I walked upstairs to my old bedroom, which my parents had converted into a guest room, but still contained some of my personal belongings from high school and college. I sat on the bed and began composing a group text message that would go out to my parents, Marcus and Sophia, simultaneously. I wanted to make sure everyone received the same information at the same time. The message I composed was straightforward and professional. Effective immediately, both properties will be transitioning to standard landlord-tenant arrangements with market-rate rent, security deposits, and formal lease agreements. Property management and legal representatives will be in contact this week to begin the transition process. This decision is final and non-negotiable. I stared at the message for several minutes before sending it. Once I hit send, there would be no pretending that this was a misunderstanding or emotional overreaction. This would be a clear declaration that I was no longer willing to subsidize people who treated me with disrespect and exclusion. At 12:47 a.m., I sent the message. The responses began almost immediately. My phone started ringing within 30 seconds, but I had already turned the ringer off and placed it face down on the bedside table. I could see the screen lighting up repeatedly with incoming calls and messages, but I wasn't ready to engage with the emotional manipulation and guilt-tripping that I knew would follow. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching short-term rental management companies that could handle both properties if my family chose not to sign standard lease agreements. I looked at comparable rental prices for similar properties in both neighborhoods and felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret as I realized how much money I'd been essentially giving away each month. The Scottsdale townhouse could easily rent for $4,000 monthly to a traveling executive or relocated professional. That was more than double what Marcus and Sophia had been contributing sporadically to the household expenses. The Awatuki house could bring in at least $2,800 from a family looking for a quality rental in a good school district. My parents had been contributing around $800 monthly, and only when they remembered. By 1:30 a.m., I had calculated that transitioning both properties to market rate rentals would increase my monthly income by approximately $5,500. Over the course of a year, that represented more than $66,000 in additional income that I could use for my own goals and investments, rather than subsidizing people who had shown they didn't value my sacrifice. The knowledge that I had been essentially giving away more than $60,000 annually to people who excluded me from family celebrations was both infuriating and liberating. I felt angry at myself for allowing the situation to continue for so long, but also proud that I was finally taking action to correct it. Around 2 a.m., the house finally grew quiet as the last guests departed and my family retreated to their bedrooms. I could hear Marcus and Sophia talking in hushed, urgent tones in the guest bathroom as they got ready for bed, probably trying to process the text message I'd sent and figure out how to respond. My parents' bedroom door closed with a soft click, and I imagined them lying awake discussing the implications of my announcement. I felt surprisingly peaceful as I prepared for bed in my childhood room, knowing that tomorrow would bring a fundamental shift in family dynamics. For years, I had been bending over backwards to accommodate everyone else's needs and preferences, while my own feelings and boundaries were consistently dismissed. That pattern was ending permanently. As I drifted off to sleep, I could still hear fireworks occasionally exploding in the distance as Phoenix celebrated the arrival of 2025. For me, the new year was already bringing the gift of clarity and the courage to protect my own interests, instead of constantly sacrificing them for people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. I woke up to the sound of aggressive knocking on my bedroom door at 7:23 a.m. The winter sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor as I heard my mother's voice calling my name with an urgency that told me the reality of my late-night decisions had finally sunk in. "Emma, we need to talk right now. This is ridiculous." Her voice carried the sharp edge of panic mixed with indignation that I'd grown accustomed to whenever family members faced consequences for their actions. I took my time getting dressed, deliberately choosing a professional outfit that would reinforce the business nature of our new relationship. When I finally opened the door, I found my mother standing in the hallway wearing her bathrobe and an expression of disbelief. Behind her, I could see my father hovering near the stairs, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to intervene. The absence of Marcus and Sophia told me they were probably still at the townhouse, dealing with their own version of this crisis. "Mom, good morning. I assume you received my message last night." I kept my voice calm and professional, treating this like any other business discussion rather than a family emergency. "Emma, what has gotten into you? You can't just suddenly decide to charge your family rent like we're strangers. This is our home." The possessive pronoun wasn't lost on me. After being excluded from their celebration in my own property, she was now claiming ownership of the house I'd purchased and maintained for 4 years. "Actually, Mom, this isn't your home. It's my investment property that I've been allowing you to occupy rent-free. The arrangement was working when there was mutual respect and appreciation, but last night made it clear that those conditions no longer exist." My father finally approached, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours trying to understand how a family celebration had turned into a housing crisis. "Emma, honey, I think you're overreacting to what happened with the toast." Marcus explained that it was Sophia's idea, and you know how she gets about her social media content. It wasn't personal. The casual dismissal of my exclusion as Sophia's social media preference rather than a deliberate family decision was exactly the kind of minimizing I'd been dealing with for months. "Dad, I was excluded from a family celebration in my own house, while people I've never met were included. If that's not personal, then our relationship clearly isn't personal either. It's transactional. which is exactly how I'm going to treat it going forward. My mother's voice rose to the pitch she typically used when she felt her authority was being challenged. You're being vindictive and selfish. Family doesn't treat family this way. We raised you better than this. You raised me to be generous and accommodating, and I've been exactly that for years. But you also raised me to have self-respect, and that's what I'm exercising now. If you want to continue living here, you'll need to sign a standard lease agreement and pay market rate rent. If that arrangement doesn't work for you, I'll help you find alternative housing. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway, followed by rapid footsteps on the front porch. Marcus burst through the front door without knocking, his face flushed with anger and his phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. Sophia followed close behind, her usually perfect hair disheveled and her expression stormy. "Emma, what the hell is wrong with you?" Marcus's voice carried across the house as he stalked toward the stairs. "We just got served with eviction papers at 9 a.m. on New Year's Day. Are you out of your mind?" I descended the stairs slowly, maintaining the calm demeanor I'd cultivated through years of managing difficult real estate negotiations. "Good morning, Marcus. I see Derek's team was punctual with the notice delivery. I specifically requested early service to ensure everyone understood the seriousness of the situation." Sophia stepped forward, her influencer persona completely dropped in favor of raw anger. "You can't evict us. We've been living there for 3 years. We have rights as tenants, and you can't just kick us out because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown." "Actually, Sophia, since you've never had a formal lease agreement and your rent payments have been inconsistent at best, you're considered month-to-month tenants under Arizona law. I'm well within my rights to terminate the arrangement with proper notice, which you've now received." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, looking genuinely distressed for the first time since I'd known him to face real consequences. "Emma, come on. This is about last night, isn't it? Look, I'm sorry about the toast thing. Sophia thought it would make better content if it was just couples, but we didn't mean to hurt your feelings. The reduction of my exclusion to hurt feelings, and the revelation that it was indeed about Sophia's content creation rather than family intimacy made my resolve even stronger. Marcus, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about respect and basic human decency. You excluded me from a family celebration so your girlfriend could create better social media content. In my house, using my champagne, with my decorations. Okay, fine, we screwed up, but kicking us out isn't the answer. Where are we supposed to go? Do you know how expensive rentals are right now?" Marcus's voice was taking on the wheedling tone he'd used as a child when trying to avoid consequences for his actions. "I'm aware of current rental prices, Marcus. I'm a real estate investor. I also know that the townhouse you're living in could easily rent for $4,000 a month to a professional tenant who would treat the property with respect and pay on time every month." Sophia's eyes widened as the financial implications became clear. $4,000? That's insane. We could never afford that. Which brings us to the real issue, doesn't it? You've been living a lifestyle you can't actually afford, subsidized by someone you felt comfortable treating poorly. That arrangement is ending. My mother attempted to regain control of the conversation, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used when Marcus and I were children. "Emma, enough. This has gone too far. You're destroying this family over a misunderstanding about a stupid toast. Apologize to your brother and Sophia, and let's put this nonsense behind us." The expectation that I should apologize for setting boundaries after being excluded and disrespected was so characteristic of our family dynamic that I almost laughed. "Mom, I'm not destroying anything. I'm just refusing to continue subsidizing people who treat me like an ATM rather than a family member." My father made one more attempt at mediation, his voice heavy with the weight of trying to hold the family together. "Emma, what if we all sit down and work out a compromise? Maybe We can establish some ground rules that make everyone more comfortable. The ground rules are simple, Dad. If you want to continue living in my properties, you'll pay market rate rent, sign formal lease agreements, and treat me with the respect that any landlord deserves. If those terms don't work for you, I'll help. You find alternative arrangements. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling frantically through rental listings. Emma, look at these prices. A decent 2-bedroom apartment in Scottsdale is at least $2,500, and most places want first month, last month, and security deposit up front. We don't have that kind of money saved. Then perhaps you should have considered that before deciding I wasn't important enough to include in family celebrations. Actions have consequences, Marcus. Sophia, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly exploded with indignation. This is all because of a stupid toast? You're going to make us homeless over a 5-minute ceremony that didn't even matter? Sophia, if it didn't matter, then excluding me shouldn't have been necessary for your content creation. The fact that you thought my presence would somehow diminish your social media posts tells me everything I need to know about how you view my role in this family. Your role? Sophia's voice rose to a near shriek. Your role is to be supportive of your brother's relationship and his happiness. Instead, you're being petty and controlling. My role, according to you, is to provide free housing while being excluded from family events. That's not being supportive, Sophia. That's being used. Marcus stepped between us, clearly trying to prevent the argument from escalating further. Okay, everyone calm down. Emma, what would it take for you to reconsider this? What do you actually want from us? The question revealed that Marcus still didn't understand the fundamental shift that had occurred. He was looking for a negotiation or compromise that would allow them to continue benefiting from my generosity without addressing the underlying disrespect that had caused this situation. Marcus, I want you to understand that generosity isn't an entitlement. I want you to recognize that the person providing your housing deserves basic respect and inclusion. But mostly, I want you to learn how to support yourselves instead of depending on someone you feel comfortable treating poorly. So that's it? You're just cutting us off completely? Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine panic as he realized that I wasn't offering any path back to the previous arrangement. I'm offering you the same relationship that any responsible landlord would offer good tenants. If you can afford market rate rent and want to sign a proper lease, we can discuss that option. If not, I'll give you reasonable time to find alternative housing. My mother made one final attempt to appeal to family loyalty. Emma, this is your brother. This is your family. You can't just treat us like business transactions. Mom, you're absolutely right. I can't treat family like business transactions. That's why I'm giving you a choice. We can rebuild our relationship based on mutual respect and fair arrangements, or we can end the housing arrangement entirely and work on the family relationship separately. What I won't do anymore is subsidize people who exclude me from their lives. The room fell silent as the weight of my ultimatum settled over everyone. For the first time in years, I wasn't backing down or offering to compromise my own needs to make everyone else comfortable. The silence stretched for several minutes as each family member processed the reality that their comfortable arrangements were genuinely at risk. Finally, my father spoke up, his voice quiet and thoughtful. Emma, if we agreed to pay fair rent and sign proper leases, would you consider letting us stay? Dad, I would consider any arrangement that treats me with respect and acknowledges the value of what I'm providing. But the days of free housing combined with exclusion from family events are over permanently. Marcus looked at Sophia, then back at me, clearly calculating whether they could afford to meet my terms. What kind of rent are we talking about? And what about the modifications Sophia made to the 3rd bedroom? The Scottsdale property would rent for $4,000 monthly at market rate. As for the unauthorized modifications, those would need to be restored to original condition at tenant expense, or the cost would be deducted from the security deposit. Sophia's face went pale as she realized the financial implications. $4,000 plus restoring the room? Emma, that could be $6,000 or $7,000 just to get started, not counting ongoing monthly payments. Those are the costs of living in a property like that, Sophia. The fact that you've been avoiding those costs doesn't mean they don't exist. The conversation continued for another hour, with various family members attempting different strategies to convince me to return to the previous arrangement. Marcus tried appealing to brotherly bonds. Sophia attempted to claim victim status, and my parents cycled through guilt, anger, and bargaining tactics. Through it all, I maintained the same calm, professional demeanor I used in business negotiations. I wasn't angry or emotional. I was simply stating facts and boundaries while refusing to be swayed by manipulation tactics that had worked on me for years. By noon, it had become clear that none of them were prepared to meet the financial obligations of market-rate rent. Marcus and Sophia didn't have the savings for security deposits and first month's rent, and my parents were on a fixed income that couldn't accommodate a substantial rent increase. As the family meeting broke up without resolution, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that it had come to this point, but relief that I was finally prioritizing my own needs and boundaries instead of constantly sacrificing them for people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. The afternoon brought a steady stream of phone calls from extended family members who had apparently been contacted by my parents seeking support for their position. Aunts, uncles, and cousins all called to express their shock at my extreme response to a simple misunderstanding. Each conversation followed the same pattern. The caller would express concern about family harmony, minimize the significance of my exclusion from the toast, and suggest that I was overreacting to a minor slight. When I explained the pattern of disrespect and financial exploitation that had led to this decision, they would pivot to arguing that family should forgive and forget rather than holding grudges. Not one person who called seemed to understand that this wasn't about grudges or forgiveness. It was about establishing boundaries and refusing to continue subsidizing people who treated me poorly. The unanimous family pressure to resume my role as the generous doormat only reinforced my conviction that I was making the right decision. By evening, I had received 17 phone calls, 43 text messages, and countless social media messages from family members and family friends trying to convince me to reconsider. The sheer volume of people mobilized to pressure me back into my previous role made me realize how many people had been benefiting from my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for family harmony. None of them seemed to consider that maybe the person providing free housing to multiple family members deserved not to be excluded from family celebrations. None of them suggested that Marcus and Sophia should apologize for their role in creating this situation. The entire focus was on getting me to resume my previous role without addressing any of the underlying issues that had caused the problem. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt more confident than ever that I was taking the right approach. For the first time in years, I was prioritizing my own well-being instead of everyone else's comfort. The family's response to my boundaries only confirmed that they saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The property inspection reports arrived on Thursday morning, delivered via email with professional photographs, that documented every scratch, stain, and unauthorized modification in both properties. Jessica Torres had been thorough in her documentation, and the results were eye-opening in ways I hadn't anticipated. The Scottsdale townhouse inspection revealed over $8,000 in damages and unauthorized alterations. Sophia's content, studio conversion, had involved drilling into load-bearing walls for equipment mounts, installing electrical work without permits, and removing original fixtures that were now stored haphazardly in the garage. The hardwood floors showed significant scratching from furniture being dragged around for photo shoots, and several walls had nail holes and adhesive residue from backdrop installations. More concerning was the evidence of what Jessica categorized as excessive wear beyond normal tenant use. The kitchen countertops showed burns and stains from hot lighting equipment, The master bathroom had water damage around the tub from elaborate bath bomb photo sessions, and the living room carpet would need complete replacement due to makeup, stains, and equipment spills. The Awataki house was in better condition overall, but still showed signs of deferred maintenance and casual disregard for property preservation. The backyard landscaping I'd invested thousands in had been allowed to deteriorate, with dead plants that hadn't been replaced and irrigation systems that had been damaged and left unrepaired. Inside, the guest bathroom showed evidence of a slow leak that had been ignored long enough to cause subflooring damage. What struck me most about the reports wasn't just the financial cost of repairs, but the clear evidence that none of my family members had been treating these properties with the care and respect that homeowners typically show their own investments. They'd been living like temporary residents who expected someone else to handle maintenance and repairs, which is exactly what they were. I forwarded copies of both inspection reports to my attorney and accountant, knowing that I would need comprehensive documentation if this situation escalated to formal eviction proceedings. The reports would also be essential for calculating security deposits and repair costs if any family members decided to pursue formal lease agreements. Friday brought an unexpected development when Marcus called to request a meeting to discuss potential solutions to our housing situation. His tone was markedly different from our confrontation earlier in the week, lacking the defensive anger that had characterized our previous conversations. When I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location, he suggested a small cafe in Central Phoenix that neither of us frequented regularly. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early and had already secured a corner table away from other customers when I walked in. He looked tired and stressed in a way I hadn't seen since his college struggles with finding direction after graduation. The confident, entitled attitude he'd displayed during our family confrontation had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like genuine worry. "Emma, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know things have been tense this week, and I want to try to work something out that makes sense for everyone." I ordered my coffee and studied my brother's face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. What I saw instead was someone who appeared to be grappling with real consequences for the first time in years. "Marcus, I'm willing to listen to what you have to say, but I need you to understand that the fundamental arrangement has changed permanently. There's no going back to the informal family arrangement we had before. I get that now. I really do. This week has been a wake-up call for both Sophia and me about how much we've been depending on your generosity without really acknowledging what that meant." Marcus paused to take a sip of his coffee, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "Sophia and I have been talking a lot about what happened at the New Year's party, and we both realized that excluding you was completely wrong. She was so focused on getting the perfect content for her followers that she lost sight of what really mattered. Marcus, I appreciate you acknowledging that, but the exclusion from the toast was just the final incident in a pattern of disrespect that's been building for months. Sophia representing your home as her property and sponsored content, making unauthorized modifications, treating me like an obstacle to overcome rather than the person making your lifestyle possible. You're right about all of that. We got comfortable taking advantage of your kindness, and we started acting like we were entitled to your help instead of grateful for it." I studied Marcus's expression, trying to determine whether this apparent remorse was genuine or strategic. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" "Sophia and I want to try to meet your rental terms if you're still willing to consider a formal lease arrangement. We've been looking at other places this week, and we realize that what you're asking isn't unreasonable compared to market rates. It's just a shock because we've been living below market for so long." The admission that they'd been shocked by real rental prices rather than my demands was telling. "Marcus, the Scottsdale property would require $4,000 monthly rent, plus a security deposit, and you'd be responsible for restoring the unauthorized modifications at your own expense. Based on the inspection report, that's likely to cost several thousand additional dollars." Marcus winced at the numbers, but didn't immediately object. "How much are we talking about for the restoration costs?" The inspection documented about $8,000 in damages and unauthorized alterations. Some of that could be addressed with professional cleaning and minor repairs, but the electrical work and wall modifications would require permits and professional contractors. $8,000? Marcus's voice reflected genuine shock. I had no idea the studio setup had caused that much damage. That's what happens when you make modifications to someone else's property without permission or proper planning. Sophia treated your home like a disposable film set rather than a valuable real estate investment. Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, apparently calculating whether they could afford the financial obligations of staying in the townhouse. Emma, would you be willing to work out a payment plan for the restoration costs? If we can cover the monthly rent, could we address the repair expenses over time? That would depend on whether you're genuinely committed to a respectful tenant relationship or just looking for another way to delay taking full responsibility for your situation. What would a respectful tenant relationship look like to you? The question suggested that Marcus was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money, but about fundamentally changing how he and Sophia approached their relationship with me. It would mean treating me like any professional landlord deserves to be treated, paying rent on time every month, getting approval before making any modifications, maintaining the property appropriately, and respecting boundaries between our business relationship and our family relationship. The boundary part is important, isn't it? You don't want to be taken for granted as family while also being expected to provide business services. Marcus's insight surprised me. For the first time in our conversation, he seemed to be grasping the emotional complexity of what had been happening rather than just focusing on the practical housing arrangements. Exactly. I can be your landlord or I can be your sister who helps you navigate life challenges, but I can't be both simultaneously. When you need me to be your sister, you have to treat me like family. When you need me to be your landlord, you have to treat me like a business partner. That makes sense. We've been expecting you to provide landlord services while treating you like someone who didn't deserve basic family respect. I felt a flicker of hope that Marcus might genuinely understand the situation, but I reminded myself to focus on actions rather than words. Marcus, understanding the problem is a good start, but I need to see consistent follow-through over time before I'll believe that the dynamic has really changed. What would that follow-through look like? Sophia would need to publicly acknowledge the property ownership situation and correct any previous social media content that misrepresented the townhouse as her own property. You'd both need to commit to the financial obligations of the lease without expecting family discounts or flexibility. And you'd need to demonstrate that you can maintain a respectful relationship even when I have to make landlord decisions you don't like. Marcus nodded slowly, but I could see concern in his expression. The social media correction is going to be hard for Sophia. Her whole brand is built around lifestyle content, and admitting she's been renting rather than owning could hurt her credibility with sponsors. Marcus, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this situation. Sophia's brand concerns don't take priority over honest representation of property ownership. If her business model depends on lying about her living situation, then her business model has fundamental problems. You're right. I'm still thinking about this wrong, aren't I? I'm still trying to figure out how to minimize consequences instead of just accepting responsibility. The self-awareness in Marcus's response was encouraging, but I'd heard similar insights from him before during family conflicts that ultimately ended with him reverting to old patterns once the immediate crisis passed. Marcus, I want to believe that you're sincere about changing your approach, but I need to see concrete actions rather than just understanding. If you and Sophia want to pursue a formal lease arrangement, you'll need to demonstrate your commitment with a substantial security deposit and first month's rent up front. How substantial are we talking about? Standard practice would be first month, last month, and security deposit equivalent to 2 months' rent. That would be $16,000 before you could move forward with a lease. Marcus's face went pale as he processed the financial requirements. Emma, we don't have that kind of money saved. Between Christmas expenses and our regular bills, we might be able to pull together maybe $6,000 if we used credit cards and asked Sophia's parents for help. Then you're not ready to be responsible tenants, Marcus. Part of being able to afford a rental property is having the financial stability to meet standard leasing requirements. What if we could come up with the money over the next few months? Could we work out some kind of transition period? I could see Marcus slipping back into negotiation mode, looking for ways to modify the terms rather than meeting the standard requirements. Marcus, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're still looking for special family treatment instead of accepting the reality of what adult housing arrangements require. I'm not trying to take advantage. I'm just trying to figure out how to make this work. Making it work means having the financial resources to meet your obligations, not finding ways to avoid meeting them. If you can't afford the upfront costs of the lease, then you can't afford to live there. Marcus stared into his coffee cup for a long time before speaking again. You really aren't going to give us any family breaks or special considerations, are you? Marcus, I gave you family breaks for 3 years. I provided below-market housing, flexible payment arrangements, and tolerance for property modifications that I would never accept from other tenants. The family breaks are what created this situation where you felt comfortable excluding me from family events. So what happens now? Do Sophia and I just have to move out? You have until the end of January to either meet the lease requirements or find alternative housing. That gives you 4 weeks to figure out your next steps. Marcus looked genuinely distressed as the timeline became concrete. Emma, I know we screwed up, but is there any way to extend that deadline? 4 weeks isn't very long to come up with $16,000 and find a new place if we can't meet your terms. 4 weeks is longer than most landlords would provide for tenants who haven't been paying market rate rent. I'm being generous with the timeline because you're family, but I'm not being flexible about the terms. What about Mom and Dad? Are you going to require the same kind of upfront payment from them? The question about our parents brought up complications I'd been avoiding thinking about. Unlike Marcus and Sophia, my parents were on fixed incomes and genuinely couldn't afford market rate rent for a house like the one they'd been living in. Your parents' situation is different because they don't have the earning potential that you and Sophia do, but they'll still need to commit to a formal arrangement that acknowledges property ownership and establishes clear expectations. Are you going to make them move out too? I'm going to offer them a lease arrangement they can afford, but it will be a formal agreement with clear terms rather than the informal family arrangement we've had. Marcus seemed relieved that our parents wouldn't face the same financial pressure he and Sophia were dealing with. That's fair. They never treated you the way we did. The acknowledgement that his behavior had been different from our parents' approach was another encouraging sign, but I remained focused on actions rather than insights. Marcus, I hope you and Sophia can figure out a way to meet the lease requirements. But if you can't, I'll help you find alternative housing that fits your actual budget. Either way, the current arrangement ends at the end of January. I understand. And Emma, I really am sorry about how we've been treating you. Even if we can't work out the housing situation, I want you to know that I realize we were wrong. As we left the coffee shop, I felt cautiously optimistic that Marcus might genuinely be ready to change his approach to our relationship. But I also knew that the real test would come when he had to follow through on his commitments, rather than just acknowledging them in conversation. The weekend brought a call from Sophia, who requested her own meeting to discuss what she called clearing the air between us. Unlike Marcus's conciliatory approach, Sophia's tone carried an edge of defensiveness that suggested she was less ready to accept responsibility for her role in creating our current situation. When we met for lunch on Sunday, Sophia arrived with a folder of printouts that she placed on the table between us like evidence in a legal case. Emma, I've been doing research on tenant rights, and I think you should know that evicting family members can be more complicated than you might realize. The opening move of threatening legal action rather than addressing the underlying relationship issues told me everything I needed to know about Sophia's approach to our conversation. Sophia, I'm not evicting anyone. I'm choosing not to renew informal arrangements that weren't working for me. There's a significant legal difference, and my attorney has confirmed that I'm well within my rights to establish formal lease requirements. But we've been living there for 3 years. That has to establish some kind of residency rights. Residency rights don't include the right to live below market rate indefinitely or to exclude your landlord from family events. If you want to pursue legal challenges to my decision, you're welcome to consult with your own attorney. Sophia's folder apparently contained more than just tenant rights research because she pulled out printed screenshots of comparable rental properties. I've been looking at what similar places cost, and $4,000 is definitely on the high end of the market. Sophia, the Scottsdale property is a premium location with high-end finishes in a desirable neighborhood. $4,000 is actually below market for comparable properties, especially considering the recent improvements I've made. But it would be almost 3 times what we've been paying you. What you've been paying sporadically when you remembered, and only after I reminded you that bills were due. Consistent, reliable tenants pay their rent automatically on the 1st of every month without having to be asked. Sophia's prepared arguments weren't addressing the real issues any more effectively than Marcus's initial defensive approach had. She was still focused on finding ways to avoid consequences rather than addressing the behavior that had created consequences. Emma, I know you're upset about the New Year's thing, but don't you think this reaction is a little extreme? We're talking about potentially making us homeless over a party planning mistake. The continued minimization of the exclusion as a party planning mistake, rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize social media content over family relationships, showed that Sophia still didn't understand the fundamental problem. Sophia, this isn't about one party. This is about a pattern of taking my generosity for granted while treating me like an obstacle to your goals rather than the person making your lifestyle possible. I never treated you like an obstacle. You represented my property as your own in sponsored content, made unauthorized modifications without permission, and suggested excluding me from family events because my presence would hurt your content quality. How is that not treating me like an obstacle? Sophia shifted uncomfortably, apparently realizing that her prepared arguments weren't addressing the specific examples of disrespectful behavior I was citing. The sponsored content thing was just creative marketing. Influencers always present their lives in the most appealing way possible. It's not meant to be literally accurate about every detail. Sophia, when you profit from representing someone else's property as your own, that goes beyond creative marketing into potential fraud. You've been building your brand on lifestyle content that you can only afford because of my subsidies. So what if I have? You've benefited from having us maintain the property and keep it occupied. It's not like you've been losing money on the arrangement. The suggestion that I'd been benefiting from their occupancy despite receiving below-market contributions and dealing with property damage was so disconnected from reality that I struggled to respond calmly. Sophia, the inspection report documented $8,000 in damage to the townhouse, mostly from your content creation activities. I've been losing money on this arrangement for months. Those weren't damages, they were improvements. The studio setup increased the functionality of that room. Unauthorized electrical work and holes drilled in load-bearing walls aren't improvements, Sophia. They're expensive problems that I'll have to pay to fix. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sophia cycling through various arguments, designed to avoid taking responsibility for her role in creating our current situation. She alternated between minimizing the significance of her behavior, claiming victim status, and threatening legal action. By the end of our lunch, it was clear that Sophia wasn't prepared to accept the fundamental changes necessary for a respectful landlord-tenant relationship. Unlike Marcus, who seemed to genuinely understand that their approach had been problematic, Sophia remained focused on finding ways to continue benefiting from my generosity without addressing the underlying disrespect. As January progressed toward its end, the deadline for my family members to make their housing decisions was approaching rapidly. The conversations with Marcus and Sophia had clarified that while Marcus might be ready to change his approach, they were unlikely to be able to meet the financial requirements of a formal lease arrangement. My parents had been notably quiet during the weeks following our confrontation, apparently taking time to process the implications of our new dynamic before deciding how to respond. When my mother finally called to request a family meeting, her tone was subdued rather than demanding, suggesting that she'd spent considerable time thinking about our situation. The final family meeting took place on a cold January afternoon in the living room of the Awatuki house, with all 4 of us present for the first time since New Year's Eve. The atmosphere was markedly different from our previous confrontations, lacking the heated emotions and defensive arguments that had characterized our earlier discussions. Instead, there was a sense of resignation mixed with determination as we gathered to finalize the housing arrangements that would define our relationships going forward. My mother had prepared coffee and arranged chairs in a circle, treating the occasion with the formality it deserved. My father sat quietly with a folder of documents he'd been organizing throughout the week, while Marcus appeared nervous but resolved. Sophia's absence was notable and deliberate, as she had chosen to stay at the townhouse rather than participate in what she described as family drama that doesn't concern me. The irony of Sophia's statement wasn't lost on me. For someone who had been so instrumental in creating the drama through her social media priorities and property misrepresentation, her claim that the resolution didn't concern her was perfectly consistent with her pattern of avoiding responsibility while expecting to continue benefiting from the outcomes. Emma, we've all had time to think about what's happened and what needs to change, my mother began, her voice steady but lacking its usual authoritative tone. Your father and I want to start by acknowledging that we handled the New Year's situation poorly. We got caught up in Sophia's vision for the evening and forgot to consider how our decisions would affect you. The apology was more direct and specific than I'd expected, addressing the actual incident rather than minimizing it as a misunderstanding or communication failure. However, I noticed that even in her apology, my mother was framing their decision as being influenced by Sophia, rather than taking full ownership of their choice to exclude me. My father nodded in agreement, adding his own perspective to their acknowledgement. Emma, I realize now that handing you my suitcase and looking away when you clearly needed support was cowardly. I was trying to avoid conflict, but I ended up abandoning you when you needed me to stand up for what was right. His willingness to use the word cowardly to describe his own behavior suggested a level of self-reflection that surprised me. My father had always been conflict-averse, preferring to maintain peace through avoidance rather than addressing difficult situations directly. For him to acknowledge that his avoidance had caused harm was significant progress. I appreciate both of you acknowledging what happened, I said carefully, but I need to understand what you're proposing for our housing arrangement going forward. The informal family arrangement we had before can't continue, regardless of apologies or good intentions. My mother reached for a folder she'd placed on the coffee table and pulled out several documents that appeared to be rental agreements she'd found online. The pages were marked with highlighter and handwritten notes, showing that she'd invested considerable time in researching standard lease practices. We've been researching what standard lease arrangements look like, and we want to propose a formal agreement that acknowledges your ownership while allowing us to continue living here, she said, spreading the documents across the coffee table like evidence of her preparation. The initiative they'd shown in researching rental agreements rather than expecting me to handle all the details was a positive sign that they were taking the situation seriously. However, I remained skeptical about whether their research had led to realistic expectations about the financial obligations of market-rate housing. What kind of arrangement are you thinking about? I asked, curious to see whether their proposal would demonstrate genuine understanding of landlord-tenant relationships or just be another attempt to maintain favorable terms while appearing more formal. My father opened his folder and pulled out a handwritten budget breakdown that showed their monthly income and expenses in detail. The document was surprisingly comprehensive, including categories I wouldn't have expected them to track, such as entertainment expenses and discretionary spending. Emma, we've calculated what we can realistically afford to pay in rent while still covering our other obligations. We can commit to $1,200 monthly, paid automatically on the first of each month through bank transfer. The amount was significantly higher than their previous sporadic contributions, but still well below market rate for the property. However, the specific commitment to automatic monthly payments and their detailed financial planning showed they were approaching this as a genuine business arrangement rather than an informal family favor. $1,200 is below market rate for this property, I said, studying their budget breakdown, but it's a substantial increase from what you've been contributing. What other terms are you proposing? My mother consulted her notes before responding, reading from a handwritten list that suggested she'd spent hours preparing for this conversation. We want to sign a year-long lease with clear terms about maintenance responsibilities, modifications, and renewal options. We also want to establish a security deposit that shows we're committed to treating this as a real rental arrangement. The proposal was more comprehensive than I'd expected, suggesting they'd invested considerable time in understanding standard rental practices. Their willingness to commit to a full year rather than seeking month-to-month flexibility was particularly encouraging. What about property maintenance and improvements? I asked, remembering the inspection findings that had revealed years of deferred maintenance and casual neglect. We would handle routine maintenance like lawn care and minor repairs, but any major improvements or modifications would require your written approval as the property owner. We want to take better care of the landscaping and address some of the deferred maintenance issues that the inspection identified. Their acknowledgement of the maintenance problems and willingness to address them was encouraging. Unlike Marcus and Sophia's defensive responses to the inspection findings, my parents seemed ready to take responsibility for property care without being forced or threatened. My father pulled out another document from his folder, this one showing a detailed timeline for addressing various maintenance issues. We've prioritized the problems based on urgency and cost, and we'd like to tackle them systematically over the next 6 months. The irrigation repairs are first priority, followed by the exterior painting that's been needed for 2 years. The systematic approach to maintenance planning was completely different from their usual pattern of ignoring problems until they became emergencies. They were proposing to take proactive responsibility rather than reactive crisis management. Dad, what about the security deposit? That's typically a significant upfront expense for any rental arrangement. We can provide $500 as an initial security deposit, and we'd like to establish a small monthly escrow account where we set aside money for future maintenance and repairs. That way, if something major comes up, we're prepared to handle it without creating a financial crisis or burdening you with unexpected expenses. The escrow account idea demonstrated forward thinking that was completely different from the crisis-driven approach my family typically took to financial planning. They were proposing to plan ahead for expenses rather than just reacting when problems arose. How much would you contribute to the escrow account monthly? I asked, impressed by their initiative but wanting to understand the practical details. We're thinking $50 monthly, which would build up to $600 annually for maintenance reserves. Combined with our general handiwork and routine care, that should cover most issues that arise. Marcus, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up with a voice that carried more gravity than I'd heard from him in years. Emma, Sophia, and I have been talking about our situation too, and we've made some decisions about the townhouse. What kind of decisions? We've realized that we can't afford to meet your lease requirements, at least not right now. We're going to move out by the end of the month and find something that fits our actual budget rather than continuing to live beyond our means. Marcus's straightforward acknowledgement that they couldn't afford the townhouse was a significant departure from his previous attempts to negotiate modified terms or payment plans. For the first time, he was accepting financial reality, rather than looking for ways to avoid it. Have you found alternative housing? We've put a deposit on a one-bedroom apartment in Tempe. It's much smaller than what we're used to, and it's not in the trendy area that Sophia prefers. But it's what we can actually afford without depending on family subsidies or credit card debt. The decision to downsize to what they could afford independently, rather than seeking help from Sophia's family or other sources, showed genuine acceptance of their financial limitations. More importantly, it showed that Marcus was prioritizing financial independence over maintaining appearances. How does Sophia feel about the downsizing? Marcus's expression became somewhat strained as he addressed his girlfriend's reaction to their changed circumstances. She's not happy about it, obviously. The apartment won't work for her content creation the way the townhouse did, and she's going to have to completely rethink her social media strategy. Is she planning to make the social media corrections we discussed about property ownership? She's been putting that off, hoping the situation would somehow resolve differently. But I told her it needs to happen before we move out. It's not fair to you to leave false information online about property ownership, and it's not fair to her followers to build her brand on misrepresentations. Marcus's willingness to prioritize honesty over Sophia's brand concerns was encouraging, though I wondered whether he would follow through when faced with her inevitable resistance and emotional manipulation. Marcus, what about the restoration costs for the unauthorized modifications? The inspection documented significant damage that needs professional attention. We can't afford to hire professional contractors to fix everything immediately, but I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks doing as much of the restoration work as I can myself. I've been watching YouTube videos about wall repair and researching the proper techniques for undoing the electrical modifications. The initiative to handle repairs personally, rather than just walking away from the damage, was more responsibility than I'd expected Marcus to take. However, I was concerned about the quality and safety of amateur electrical work. That's a good start, but some of the electrical work will need to be done by licensed contractors to meet code requirements and ensure safety. Are you prepared to cover those costs? I've gotten quotes from 2 electricians, and I can cover the electrical restoration if you're willing to deduct it from my security deposit, rather than requiring upfront payment. The total cost is about $1,500, which is less than I expected. Marcus had clearly spent considerable time researching the costs and logistics of addressing the property damage, which was a significant departure from his usual approach of hoping problems would resolve themselves or that someone else would handle them. My mother interrupted our discussion to address the broader family implications of these housing changes. Emma, we want you to know that we understand this isn't just about rental arrangements. We recognize that we've been taking your generosity for granted and treating you unfairly in ways that go beyond property management. What does that recognition look like in practice, Mom? It means we want to rebuild our relationship as family members, separate from our roles as landlord and tenant. When we're dealing with housing issues, we'll treat you as our landlord and respect your business decisions without expecting family favoritism. When we're spending time together as family, we'll make sure you're included and valued as our daughter. The distinction between landlord and family relationships was exactly what I'd been hoping they would understand. The fact that they'd articulated it clearly suggested they'd spent considerable time thinking about the complexity of our dual relationship. How do we maintain that boundary when the roles overlap, or when there's confusion about which relationship applies to a given situation? My father offered his perspective on managing the dual relationship. We think the key is being clear about which role you're operating in during any given interaction. If we're discussing rent or property issues, we're talking to our landlord, and we'll approach those conversations with appropriate formality. If we're planning family gatherings or holidays, we're talking to our daughter and sister. And if there's ever confusion about which role applies, We'll ask for clarification rather than assuming we can blur the boundaries for our own convenience, my mother added. Their thoughtful approach to managing the complexity of our dual relationship showed they'd invested considerable effort in understanding the challenges I'd been facing. More importantly, they seemed to recognize that my discomfort hadn't been unreasonable or overly sensitive. What about family events and celebrations? How do we ensure that property ownership doesn't create awkwardness during family gatherings? And more importantly, how do we prevent future situations like the New Year's exclusion? Marcus answered before my parents could respond, his voice carrying conviction that I hadn't heard from him in years. Emma, you should never be excluded from family events because of property ownership or any other reason. What happened at New Year's was completely wrong, and it won't happen again as long as I have any influence over family planning. How can you guarantee that, Marcus? You were the one who made the decision to exclude me in the first place. Because I've learned that putting Sophia's preferences ahead of family relationships creates problems that aren't worth the temporary peace or convenience. If she can't handle family events that include everyone, then she can choose not to. Attend rather than asking for other people to be excluded. Marcus's commitment to prioritizing family inclusion over his girlfriend's comfort level was a significant shift from his previous approach of managing competing demands by sacrificing my feelings for Sophia's preferences. What if she pressures you to modify that position or threatens your relationship over family inclusion issues? Then we'll have a relationship problem that's separate from our family relationships. I'm not going to let anyone, including Sophia, drive wedges between me and my family anymore. I've realized that relationships built on excluding other people aren't healthy or sustainable. The conversation continued for another 2 hours as we worked through the practical details of implementing our new arrangements. We established move-out schedules, security deposit procedures, maintenance protocols, and communication guidelines that would govern our ongoing relationships. We also discussed emergency procedures, renewal terms, and conflict resolution processes that would apply if disagreements arose in the future. My parents suggested establishing quarterly check-ins where we could address any issues before they became major problems. By the time we finished, I felt cautiously optimistic that we were creating a foundation for healthier family dynamics. My parents had demonstrated genuine understanding of the issues and proposed reasonable solutions that showed respect for both business and family considerations. Marcus had shown unexpected maturity in accepting responsibility and prioritizing family relationships over convenience. The following week was busy with move-out logistics and property transitions. Marcus worked diligently to restore the townhouse, handling minor repairs himself, and coordinating with contractors for the electrical work that required professional attention. His efforts weren't perfect, but they showed genuine commitment to leaving the property in good condition. I was surprised by Marcus's dedication to the restoration work. He spent entire days spackling holes, sanding walls, and researching proper repair techniques. When I stopped by to check on his progress, I found him covered in paint and drywall dust, taking pride in work that was clearly outside his comfort zone. I never realized how much damage we'd actually done, he said, showing me before and after photos of the room that had been converted to Sophia's studio. When you're living with changes gradually, you don't notice how much accumulates over time. The restoration work was also revealing things about Marcus that I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. He was methodical and careful, taking time to do things properly rather than rushing through tasks. The brother who had always taken shortcuts was investing serious effort in making things right. Sophia remained notably absent from the restoration work, choosing to focus on packing and apartment hunting rather than addressing the damage her content creation had caused. Her social media posts during this period painted the move as a positive lifestyle choice, talking about downsizing for intentional living and embracing minimalism, rather than acknowledging the circumstances that had necessitated the change. When Marcus finally convinced her to post a correction about the property ownership, Her response was minimal and buried in a long caption about new adventures. The correction technically addressed the misrepresentation, but it was clear that she remained resistant to taking full responsibility for her role in our conflict. "She's still angry about having to make the correction," Marcus admitted when I asked about Sophia's continued resentment. "She thinks it makes her look unprofessional to her followers, but I told her that misrepresenting property ownership was what was actually unprofessional." The fact that Marcus was willing to contradict Sophia's perspective and hold her accountable for ethical business practices showed significant growth in his ability to maintain his own standards rather than just accommodating her preferences. My parents began their transition to formal tenancy with impressive organization and commitment. They set up automatic rent payments, established their maintenance escrow account, and immediately began addressing the landscaping issues identified in the property inspection. More importantly, they started treating our landlord-tenant interactions with appropriate formality while maintaining warmth in our family relationships. When my mother called to ask about replacing a broken sprinkler head, she approached it as a tenant, seeking landlord approval, providing cost estimates, and asking for written permission. When she called to invite me for Sunday dinner, she approached it as a mother wanting to spend time with her daughter. The boundary management wasn't perfect initially, and we had several conversations about when to invoke which type of relationship. But their willingness to navigate the complexity, rather than ignoring it, made the arrangement workable in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, my father called with what he described as a landlord question about installing motion sensor lights for security purposes. He had researched the options, obtained quotes, and prepared a formal proposal for my approval. The level of preparation and respect he showed for the approval process was completely different from their previous approach of making changes and informing me after the fact. By February, the new dynamics were settling into sustainable patterns. Marcus and Sophia were adjusting to their smaller apartment and more realistic budget, though Sophia continued to express resentment about the lifestyle changes. She had been forced to dramatically reduce her content creation due to the limited space and lighting in their new apartment, which affected her income and online presence. Marcus, however, seemed to be thriving in their more modest circumstances. He had taken on additional freelance writing projects to compensate for the higher rent, and the necessity of managing a tight budget was bringing out organizational skills I hadn't known he possessed. "It's actually kind of liberating," he told me during one of our weekly check-in calls. "We know exactly what we can afford, and we're not constantly worried about when the next bill will come or how we'll cover unexpected expenses." My parents were thriving in their formal rental arrangement, taking pride in being responsible tenants while enjoying a more honest family relationship. They had addressed most of the deferred maintenance issues and were staying ahead of seasonal care requirements that they'd previously ignored. The most noticeable change was in their attitude toward the property. Instead of treating it as a place they were entitled to occupy, they approached it as a valuable asset they were privileged to rent. They asked permission before making any changes, maintained detailed records of their maintenance activities, and took pride in keeping the property in excellent condition. The Scottsdale townhouse was quickly rented to a pharmaceutical executive who was relocating to Phoenix for a 2-year assignment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell paid the full market rate without question, treated the property with respect, and never questioned my decisions as a landlord. She also had the financial stability to handle any unexpected expenses and the professional maturity to communicate clearly about any issues that arose. The contrast between Dr. Mitchell's approach and my family's previous behavior was stark and illuminating. She submitted rental applications with complete financial documentation, provided professional references, and paid her security deposit and first month's rent without attempting to negotiate terms or seek special accommodations. When she needed to request approval for minor modifications like installing additional cable outlets, she submitted formal written requests with detailed plans and contractor estimates. She treated our landlord-tenant relationship with the professionalism and respect that should be standard in such arrangements. The increased rental income from both properties allowed me to accelerate my real estate investment timeline and consider expanding my portfolio more aggressively. For the first time in years, my properties were generating the income they should have been producing all along, which opened up opportunities for additional investments. More importantly, I was no longer carrying the emotional burden of subsidizing people who treated me poorly. The mental energy I'd been spending on family drama and financial stress was redirected toward my own goals and interests. I enrolled in an advanced real estate investment course focused on commercial properties and began exploring opportunities in office buildings and retail spaces. The course introduced me to investment strategies I'd never considered and connected me with other investors who were building substantial portfolios. I also started dating someone I met through my real estate networking group, someone who appreciated my business acumen rather than seeing it as a resource to exploit. David was a contractor who specialized in property renovations, and he understood the work and risk involved in real estate investing. Our relationship developed naturally around shared interests and mutual respect, rather than financial dependence or family obligation. When David offered to help with maintenance projects on my properties, he did so as a partner sharing expertise rather than someone seeking free housing or financial benefits. The family relationships weren't perfect, but they were honest in ways they hadn't been for years. My parents and I developed a stronger connection once the financial stress and unclear boundaries were removed. We could enjoy each other's company without underlying tensions about money or unmet expectations. Marcus and I began rebuilding our sibling relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Our conversations became more genuine as we were no longer navigating the awkward dynamics of benefactor and dependent. He started asking for my advice on career decisions and financial planning, approaching me as a sister with valuable expertise rather than someone he needed to manage or appease. Sophia remained a source of tension, continuing to resent the changes and pressure Marcus to distance himself from family events that included me. She made passive-aggressive comments about the family's dramatic overreaction to the New Year's situation and frequently suggested that Marcus was being manipulated by family guilt. But Marcus held firm to his commitment to maintain family relationships, and over time, Sophia either adjusted to the new dynamic or chose not to participate in family gatherings. Her absence was sometimes awkward, but it was preferable to the toxic dynamics that occurred when she attended events while harboring resentment. The most significant change was in my own self-perception and boundaries. I no longer felt obligated to sacrifice my own needs for family harmony. I'd learned that real family harmony couldn't be built on one person's unlimited sacrifice and everyone else's unlimited taking. I also discovered that establishing boundaries had benefits beyond just protecting myself from exploitation. By requiring my family members to take responsibility for their own choices and financial obligations, I had actually helped them develop skills and confidence they wouldn't have gained if I'd continued enabling their dependence. Marcus became more organized and financially responsible when he was forced to manage his own budget without subsidies. My parents developed better maintenance habits and took more pride in their living space when they were invested in it as responsible tenants rather than passive beneficiaries. The lesson that setting boundaries could strengthen relationships, rather than destroying them, was one I applied to other areas of my life as well. I became more selective about freelance work that didn't pay well, more assertive about social obligations that didn't serve my interests, and more careful about dating people who seemed primarily interested in my financial resources. 6 months after the New Year's Eve confrontation, I hosted a family barbecue in my backyard to celebrate my parents' wedding anniversary. Marcus and Sophia attended, along with several extended family members who had witnessed our previous conflicts. The gathering was relaxed and enjoyable in ways our family events hadn't been for years. Everyone knew where they stood, what was expected of them, and what boundaries needed to be respected. There were no underlying tensions about money or property, or unspoken resentments about fairness. My parents moved comfortably between their roles as my tenants and my parents, asking landlord questions about outdoor lighting installation, while also sharing family stories and anniversary memories. Marcus contributed to dinner preparation and cleanup without being asked, treating the event as a family member rather than a guest expecting to be served. Even Sophia's behavior was noticeably different. While she remained somewhat distant, she didn't make any passive-aggressive comments about the property arrangements or attempt to position herself as a victim of family drama. She seemed to have accepted that the boundaries were permanent rather than continuing to hope they would be abandoned for her convenience. When we raised our glasses for a toast to my parents' anniversary, everyone was included. No one was excluded for content creation purposes or lifestyle branding concerns. We celebrated as a family that had learned to value each person's presence rather than taking anyone for granted. The toast itself was simple and heartfelt, focusing on my parents' love and commitment rather than anyone's social media content or public image. Marcus spoke about the example they had set for lasting relationships, and I shared memories of family traditions they had created and maintained throughout our childhood. As I looked around the table at my family, I realized that establishing boundaries hadn't destroyed our relationships as I'd feared it might. Instead, it had created space for genuine respect and appreciation to grow. By refusing to continue subsidizing people who treated me poorly, I'd forced everyone to confront their own behavior and make conscious choices about what kind of relationships they wanted to have. The woman who had watched her family's New Year's celebration through a kitchen window was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and insisted that others recognize it too. The change hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary for creating the kind of family relationships that were sustainable and fulfilling for everyone involved. Real estate had taught me that you can't build lasting value on unstable foundations. The same principle applied to family relationships. By establishing clear boundaries and fair arrangements, we'd created a foundation strong enough to support genuine love and respect rather than just obligation and resentment. The journey from doormat to property owner who demanded respect had been challenging, but it had also been liberating. I'd learned that family loyalty doesn't require unlimited sacrifice, and that love without respect isn't really love at all. The people who truly cared about me were willing to meet reasonable expectations for respectful behavior. The people who weren't willing to do that had revealed their true priorities. As the evening wound down and family members began heading home to their own properties, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with real estate values or rental income. I'd created something more valuable than financial security. I'd created relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, and a life where my worth wasn't determined by how much I was willing to sacrifice for others. The New Year's toast that had excluded me had become the catalyst for the most important boundary setting of my life. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually the beginning of something much better. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important lessons about our own value and strength. That night, as I cleaned up from the anniversary celebration in my own backyard, surrounded by the evidence of genuine family connection built on honest foundations, I realized that being excluded from their toast had been the greatest gift my family could have given me. It had forced me to finally choose myself, and that choice had transformed everything. The year that followed brought continued growth and stability in all areas of my life. My real estate portfolio expanded to include 2 commercial properties, and I was earning enough passive income to consider reducing my traditional work hours to focus more on investment activities and personal interests. My relationship with David deepened into something serious and committed, built on mutual support and shared goals rather than financial dependence or family obligation. When we discussed moving in together, it was as equal partners combining resources rather than one person providing housing for the other. Marcus and Sophia's relationship faced its own tests as they navigated the realities of living within their actual means, but Marcus continued to prioritize family relationships over Sophia's preferences when conflicts arose. They eventually broke up, though not specifically over family issues, and Marcus began dating someone who appreciated rather than resented his close family connections. My parents continued to be excellent tenants and gradually transitioned back to a close family relationship as the boundaries between landlord and family roles became more natural and less forced. They took pride in their responsible tenancy, while enjoying the security of knowing they could afford their housing long term. The extended family members who had initially pressured me to abandon my boundaries and resume my role as the family benefactor eventually came to understand that the changes had been necessary and beneficial for everyone involved. Some of them even asked for advice on establishing their own boundaries in similar situations. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about what I deserved and what I was willing to accept in my relationships. The skills I developed in establishing boundaries with my family transferred to every other area of my life, making me more confident in professional negotiations, more selective in friendships, and more assertive in romantic relationships. Looking back on that New Year's Eve when I watched my family's celebration through a kitchen window, I could see that the exclusion had been the beginning of the most important personal growth of my life. It had forced me to choose between continuing to enable disrespectful behavior or demanding the respect I deserved. The choice to demand respect had been difficult and sometimes lonely, but it had ultimately created space for much healthier and more fulfilling relationships. The family that emerged from that crisis was smaller in some ways, as we lost some relationships that couldn't survive the requirement for mutual respect, but it was also stronger and more genuine. The woman who had spent years sacrificing her own needs for family harmony had learned that real harmony could only exist when everyone's needs were considered and respected. The property owner who had been taken for granted had become someone whose generosity was appreciated rather than expected. The transformation hadn't just changed my family relationships. It had changed my entire approach to life, teaching me that self-respect isn't selfish, and that boundaries aren't barriers to love, but rather the foundation that makes genuine love possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.